Some wounds never heal. They just learn to live with the cold. Inga the Widow has spent 10 years watching the sea, waiting for ships that will never bring her loved ones home. On the shores of Skarnfell, she tends her lighthouse alone. The village thinks her heart died with her husband and sons in the wars. When a damaged longship appears through the fog, its passenger is a giant warrior everyone thought was dead. Kael Storm-Bound has returned after a decade, seeking the one woman who wrote him letters during his exile. He steps onto her beach with fire in his eyes and tells her she'll be screaming his name tonight. She nearly drops her axe, but not from fear. Can two broken souls find healing in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Skarnfell's black cliffs like the ghosts of old sorrows, refusing to be burned away by the pale northern sun. Inga, Eric's daughter, stood at the edge of her world, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of pine needle tea that had long since grown cold. The lighthouse behind her rose like a stone sentinel against the grey sky, its beacon dark now in the daylight hours, waiting for evening to call the lost souls home. She had not always been the widow of Skarnfell. Once she had been Inga, the shipwright's wife, mother to 3 strong sons, keeper of a hearth that never grew cold. Her husband Bjorn had built the finest vessels in all of Nordmark, longships that cut through the waves like knives through silk. Their home had echoed with laughter then, with the sounds of children's feet on wooden floors and the deep voices of men planning their next voyage. But war has a way of swallowing the things we love most. The great conflict had started over trading routes, as these things always did. The southern jarls wanted control of the amber trade, while the northern clans claimed ancient rights to the sea paths their fathers had carved through treacherous waters. What began as heated words in the Thing Place became raids, then open warfare that lasted 7 brutal years, 7 years that took everything from her. First went her youngest, Orm, barely 16 and eager to prove his worth. He died in his first battle, cut down by a southern axe before he'd even drawn his own blade. Then Eric, her middle son, fell defending their village when raiders came in the night. They found him at the gates, with 5 dead enemies at his feet. But the wound in his chest had bled his life away, drop by precious drop. Gunnar, her eldest, lasted longest. He became a war leader, carrying his father's name and his mother's blessing into battle after battle. For 3 years, he brought victory after victory to their clan, until the great sea battle at Whale's Crossing, where the southern fleet trapped the northern ships in the Narrows. They said he died as he had lived, standing at the prow of his father's finest longship, calling out the old war songs as the flames consumed everything around him. Bjorn never recovered from burying their sons. The shipwright's hands that had once shaped oak and ash into vessels of beauty began to shake. He would start a project only to abandon it half-finished, standing in his workshop staring at nothing while tears fell onto sawdust that would never become a ship's prow again. He died in his sleep 2 winters later, and Inga knew it was not the cold that took him, but the weight of a heart too full of grief to keep beating. The village had wanted to care for her then, good people, with kind intentions and gentle words. But Inga had chosen solitude instead, taking on the duty of lighthouse keeper when old Magnus passed. Here at the edge of the world, she could tend the flame that guided lost travelers safely home, even as her own lost ones would never return. The lighthouse itself was ancient, built by her great-grandfather's great-grandfather, when the first Norse settlers claimed this wild coast. 3 stories of stone blocks fitted so perfectly that no mortar was needed, rising 60 feet above the highest tide line. Inside, a spiral staircase wound its way up past the keeper's quarters, past the oil storage room, to the beacon chamber. At the top, where a great mirror of polished bronze reflected the flame across the dark waters. Every evening at sunset, Inga climbed those worn stone steps, Every morning at dawn, she climbed them again to snuff the flame and clean the mirror. In between, she tended the small garden that provided her food, repaired the nets the fishermen brought her, and watched the sea for ships that might need guidance home. The villagers still came to check on her, though less frequently now. Astrid the baker brought bread twice a week, always with news of marriages and births, and the small dramas that made up village life. Thorvald the smith would appear when something needed fixing, his great hands surprisingly gentle as he mended her tools, or replaced a loose stone in the lighthouse wall. But it was young Sigrid who visited most often, drawn perhaps by some understanding of loss that her 19 years shouldn't have taught her yet. The girl had lost her own father to a late-season storm 3 years past, and perhaps she recognized in Inga's silence the same weight she carried in her own heart. "You don't have to talk," Sigrid would say, settling beside Inga on the bench that faced the sea. "Sometimes it's enough just to not be alone." It was Sigrid who had first mentioned the exile's return, though she spoke of it as village gossip rather than prophecy. "They say Kael Storm-Bound might still be alive," she had said one afternoon, her fingers working steadily at the fishing net she was mending. A trader from the eastern settlements claimed he saw a man matching his description working the silver mines in the far mountains, said he was bigger than any 3 normal men and had scars like runes carved into his face. Inga had said nothing then, but her hands had stilled on her own work. Kael Storm-Bound. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in 5 years, though it had never truly left her thoughts. He had been Jarl Thorkel's second son, born to greatness, but cursed with the restless spirit that drives some men to seek their fortunes beyond the edge of the known world. Where his older brother Harold was content to learn statecraft and manage their father's lands, Kael had trained with sword and axe until he could best grown men while still a beardless youth. The trouble began when Harold took a wife, Astrid, daughter of a powerful southern jarl whose allegiances were questionable at best. The marriage was meant to secure peace, but Kael had spoken against it openly at the Thing Place, calling it a betrayal of their ancestors' blood. Hard words had been exchanged between the brothers, words that cut deeper than any blade. Then came the night of the wedding feast, when Kael stood before the assembled guests and accused his new sister by marriage of carrying messages between her father and their enemies. The accusation might have cost a lesser man his life, but Thorkel would not see one son kill another. Instead, he chose exile, 10 years beyond the borders of Nordmark, forbidden to return until Harold ruled as Jarl and could decide his brother's fate. Kael had accepted the sentence without protest, though those who knew him saw the pain behind his stoic mask. He spent his last week in Nordmark, gathering supplies and saying his farewells, and it was during this time that he had come to see Inga. She remembered that visit clearly, though she had told no one of it then or since. He had found her in Bjorn's workshop, where she was trying to finish a small fishing boat her husband had started before his hands began to shake. The work was beyond her skill, but she could not bear to see it remain incomplete. "Let me," Kael had said simply, and his hands had moved over the wood with surprising gentleness for one so large. He worked through the afternoon without speaking, shaping and smoothing until the boat was whole and seaworthy. "Why?" she had asked as he prepared to leave. "Because some things shouldn't be left unfinished," he had replied, "and because you were kind to me when others saw only trouble." Before he left, he had asked if she would write to him during his exile, if she would send word through the traders who moved between the settlements and the distant mining camps. She had agreed, though she wondered even then why he would want letters from a grieving mother when surely there were younger, unmarked hearts that would welcome his attention. For 3 years, she had kept her promise. Once each season, she wrote to him of village life, of her garden and her lighthouse duties, of the small observations that filled the quiet hours of solitude. The letters were neither intimate nor distant, but carried within them the steady rhythm of life continuing despite loss. His replies came irregularly, sometimes 2 in a season, sometimes none for half a year. He wrote of the harsh beauty of the eastern mountains, of the back-breaking work in the silver mines, of the strange mix of outcasts and fortune-seekers who made up the exile community. But beneath the descriptions of daily life, she sensed a deeper loneliness that matched her own. Then the letters stopped coming. The last trader to carry word said that Kael's mine had been attacked by raiders, that few had survived, and none could say for certain who had lived or died. That was 7 years ago, and gradually the village had accepted that another good man had been claimed by the violence that seemed to follow wherever men gathered to dig wealth from the earth. Now, standing in the lighthouse doorway with the cold tea in her hands, Inga found herself thinking of those letters for the first time in months. The morning was advancing, and soon she would need to tend her garden and prepare for the evening's lighting ceremony. But something in the quality of the silence felt different today, as if the sea itself were holding its breath. A sound reached her then, carried on the wind from the direction of the harbor. Voices, raised not in alarm, but in excitement. She set down her cup and walked to the cliff's edge, shading her eyes against the pale sun. Below, she could see figures moving on the beach, gesturing towards something in the water. A ship, single-sailed, with the low profile of a coastal trader rather than a deep-water vessel. As she watched, it drew closer to shore, and she could make out a lone figure at the steering oar. The sail was patched in several places, and the hull showed signs of hard use, but it moved through the water with the sure grace that marked a seaworthy craft. Something stirred in her chest, a sensation so unfamiliar that for a moment she could not name it. Then she recognized it for what it was, the first flutter of hope she had felt in longer than she cared to remember. She told herself it meant nothing, that travelers came to Skarnfell regularly, and this was simply another merchant seeking shelter and supplies. But as the ship drew closer to the beach where the villagers were gathering, Inga found herself walking down the cliff path without conscious decision. Her feet knew the way, even when her mind was elsewhere, navigating the worn stone steps that her ancestors had carved into the living rock. By the time she reached the harbor, a small crowd had assembled. Thorvald was there with 2 of his apprentices, along with several fishermen and their wives. Sigrid stood near the water's edge, her hand shading her eyes as she studied the approaching vessel. "Can you make out who it is?" Astrid called from behind them. "One man, I think," Thorvald replied. "Big fellow, from the look of him." The ship was close enough now that they could hear the splash of the steering oar and the creak of rope under strain. The lone sailor had dropped the sail and was maneuvering toward the small dock that served the village's fishing fleet. He moved with the easy competence of someone who had spent years learning to handle a boat single-handed. As the hull scraped against the dock, the sailor secured his mooring lines with quick, efficient movements. Then he straightened and turned toward the gathered villagers, and Inga's breath caught in her throat. It was indeed a big man, taller than any in the village and broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of years of hard labor. His hair was longer than fashion dictated, dark with premature streaks of silver, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who had spent too many years under foreign suns. But it was the scars that marked him unmistakably as the man he claimed to be. Pale lines that crossed his left cheek in patterns that might have been runes carved by a blade that knew its business. "Kael Storm-Bound," Thorvald breathed, and the words carried clearly in the morning stillness. The returned exile smiled, and despite the scars and the years of hardship written in every line of his body, it was the same smile Inga remembered, from a decade ago. "Hello, old friend," Kael said, his voice deeper than memory but unmistakably the same. "I hope I haven't missed anything interesting." The silence that followed Kael's greeting stretched like a bowstring drawn too tight. The villagers stood frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing a homecoming or the arrival of a ghost. Even the gulls seemed to sense the weight of the moment, their usual raucous cries muted to whispers on the wind. Thorvald was the first to find his voice. "Kael Storm-Bound, as I live and breathe, we heard you were dead, lad. Reports of my death." were greatly exaggerated, Kael replied, stepping from his boat onto the weathered planks of the dock. Up close, the changes wrought by exile were even more apparent. His once powerful frame had been honed by hardship into something leaner, but no less dangerous. The easy confidence of youth had been replaced by the careful wariness of a man who had learned that survival often depended on reading the intentions of strangers. But his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had once been full of restless energy, now held depths that spoke of suffering endured and wisdom hard won. When his gaze swept the assembled crowd, it carried weight, as if he were cataloguing each face and measuring what changes 10 years had wrought. "Is my father still alive?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Aye," Thorvald nodded gravely, "though age sits heavy on him now. Your brother Harald rules the day-to-day affairs, but Jarl Thorkel still holds the high seat." Kael absorbed this news without visible reaction. "And Harald's wife?" "Astrid. Her died 3 winters past," one of the fishermen offered. "Fever took her along with their youngest." For just a moment, something flickered across Kael's scarred features. Not satisfaction at his old enemy's fate, but what might have been regret. "I'm sorry to hear it. No one should lose a child." The words carried such quiet conviction that several of the women nodded in understanding. Here was a man who had learned that some sorrows transcended old grudges. Astrid the baker stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding her caution. "You must be hungry, lad. It's a long way from wherever you've been." "The eastern mountains," Kael confirmed. "And yes, ship's rations grow tiresome after the first few weeks at sea." He paused, then added with deliberate courtesy, "I would be grateful for a hot meal and news of how the village fares." As the crowd began to disperse, people heading back to their daily tasks with much to discuss over their evening fires, Inga found herself rooted in place. She had remained at the edge of the gathering, half hidden behind Thorvald's broad shoulders, but now that the others were leaving, she felt exposed under the morning light. Kael's eyes found hers across the space. Between them, and the impact was like a physical blow. 10 years collapsed into nothing, and she was once again the woman who had written letters to an exile, sharing the small details of her life with someone who had asked for nothing but her words. "Inga," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer answered. She wanted to respond, to offer some greeting that would bridge the gap between past and present, but the words lodged in her throat like stones. For so long her voice had been reserved for the most necessary communications, directions to lost travelers, orders for supplies, the brief exchanges required by lighthouse duties. Anything more felt rusty from disuse. Instead, she nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged his return, without committing her to more than she could give, in this moment of shock and recognition. Kael seemed to understand. He did not approach her directly, but neither did he turn away. Instead, he spoke to the space between them, his voice carrying the measured tone of a man choosing his words with care. "I had hoped to find you well," he said. "Your letters meant more to me than you might have realized." The admission hung in the air like a challenge, forcing her to acknowledge the connection they had once shared. Inga felt heat rise in her cheeks. When had she last blushed like a girl, and managed to find her voice at last? "I wondered what became of you," she said, the words emerging rough from her throat. "When the letters stopped coming, the mine was attacked," he explained simply. "Raiders from the deep mountains. By the time we drove them off, there was little left worth defending. I moved on to other work." "What kind of work?" The question surprised her by emerging unbidden. Kael's smile held no humor, the kind that keeps exiles alive in unfriendly territory, guarding merchant caravans, hunting bandits, settling disputes for men who prefer steel to arbitration. "Not noble work, but it paid well enough to buy supplies and passage home." "Home," she repeated, tasting the word. "After 10 years, you still call this home." "Where else would I call home?" he asked, and something in his voice made her look directly at him for the first time since his arrival. "This is where my roots are buried." where my ancestors sleep. This is where the one person who bothered to write to an exile makes her dwelling." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried implications that made Inga's pulse quicken. Before she could formulate a response, Thorvald approached with the practical concern of a man used to managing village affairs. "Kael, you'll need somewhere to stay while you're here. The old guest house has been empty since the fever took its last keeper." "I'm not sure how long I'll be staying," Kael replied, but his eyes remained on Inga as he spoke. "That depends on several factors I haven't had time to consider." Thorvald glanced between them with the shrewd perception of a man who had lived long enough to recognize the currents that run beneath polite conversation. "Well, you're welcome as long as you choose to remain. Your exile ended when Harald became Jarl after all." "Has it?" Kael asked. "I haven't spoken to my brother yet." "You'll find him much changed," Thorvald said gently. "Grief has a way of altering a man's perspective on old grievances." As the blacksmith departed with promises to spread word of Kael's return, Inga found herself alone with the exile for the first time in 10 years. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist and revealing the full extent of the changes time had worked on both of them. "You look tired," she observed, noting the lines around his eyes and the careful way he held his left shoulder. "I am tired," he admitted. 10 years of wandering will do that to a man, but I'm here now, and that's what matters." "Why?" The question emerged more sharply than she intended. "Why come back now? Why come back at all?" Kael was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting from her face to the lighthouse rising behind her on its cliff perch. When he spoke again, his words carried the weight of carefully considered truth. "Because I learned something in exile that I was too young and foolish to understand before I left. Home isn't a place you can carry with you in memory. Home is where the people you care about choose to remain, waiting for your return, even when they have no promise that you'll ever make it back." He took a step closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, the new lines that mapped a decade of survival in hostile territory. "I came back because every night for 10 years I dreamed of this place. I dreamed of lighthouse flame cutting through the darkness, of a woman with steady hands and patient heart who wrote letters to an exile even though she had her own sorrows to bear. I came back because I finally understood that everything I was looking for in distant lands was already here, waiting." The words hit her like a physical force, stripping away the careful defenses she had built during her years of solitude. She felt suddenly exposed, as if he could see through the protective shell she had grown around her grief, and glimpse the woman she had been before loss taught her to expect nothing but endings. "I'm not the same person who wrote those letters," she said, the words emerging as both warning and confession. 10 years of solitude changes a woman. I've grown used to silence, to my own company. I don't know if I remember how to be anything else." "Neither am I the same man who left," Kael replied. "But maybe that's not what matters. Maybe what matters is whether two people who have learned hard truths about loss and survival can find their way to something resembling peace together." Before she could respond, he reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something that made her breath catch. It was a piece of carved whalebone, no longer than her palm, worked into the shape of a lighthouse with intricate detail that spoke of countless hours of patient craftsmanship. "I made this during my first winter in the mountains," he said, offering it to her. "When the snow was too deep to work the mines and there was nothing to do but wait for spring. I thought about your lighthouse, about the beacon that guided lost souls home, and I carved this to remember." Inga took the carving with hands that trembled slightly. The bone was smooth and warm, polished to a soft gleam by years of handling. Every detail was perfect. The spiral stairs, the beacon chamber, even the small garden that surrounded the base of the real lighthouse. "You kept this for 10 years, she whispered. "I kept it as a promise to myself," he said, "that someday I would return and give it to the woman who inspired it. Standing there on the dock, with the carved lighthouse in her hands and Kael Storm-Bound's weathered face before her, Inga felt the first crack appear in the wall she had built around her heart. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the wind try to lift her into flight. Everything she had convinced herself about solitude and safety was suddenly in question, and she wasn't sure whether to run toward the lighthouse or straight into his arms. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Skarnfell as Inga climbed the cliff path to her lighthouse, the carved whalebone warm in her palm. Each step upward felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of Kael's return was pulling at her ankles like chains. She had fled the harbor without another word, leaving him standing on the dock with something that might have been disappointment flickering across his scarred features. She told herself it was prudence, this retreat to solitude. 10 years of careful routine had taught her that unexpected changes brought only pain, and Kael Storm-Bound was nothing if not unexpected. Better to tend her lighthouse, prepare for the evening's lighting, and let the village gossips digest this new development without her involvement. But the whalebone lighthouse seemed to pulse with warmth against her skin, refusing to let her forget the careful devotion that had shaped every detail. A man did not carry such a thing across continents unless it held meaning beyond mere craftsmanship. The thought should have been comforting, but instead it terrified her. Inside the lighthouse, Inga moved through her afternoon rituals with mechanical precision. She checked the oil levels in the beacon chamber, cleaned the great bronze mirror that reflected the flame across the dark waters, and prepared the wick for evening lighting. Each task was familiar, soothing in its predictability. Yet today her hands felt clumsy, and her mind kept drifting to pale blue eyes and silver-threaded hair. The carved lighthouse sat on her kitchen table like an accusation, catching the light from her single window and throwing tiny shadows that reminded her of the real beacon above. She had placed it there without conscious thought, but now she could not bring herself to look directly at it. A knock at her door broke the spell of her brooding. Inga opened it to find young Sigrid standing on her threshold, eyes bright with excitement and something that looked suspiciously like matchmaking determination. "The whole village is talking," Sigrid announced, pushing past Inga into the lighthouse's main room without invitation. "Kael Storm-Bound, back from the dead and asking after you specifically. Astrid says he barely touched his food, kept looking toward the cliff path like he expected you to appear. I'm sure the village has better things to discuss than my affairs," Inga said stiffly, but she could not keep the color from rising in her cheeks. Sigrid snorted, a decidedly unladylike sound that spoke to her lack of patience for social pretense. "Nothing interesting has happened here since the last trading season. A mysterious exile returning after 10 years is the most excitement we've seen in ages, especially when he seems particularly interested in our reclusive lighthouse keeper." She settled herself at the kitchen table without being asked, her fingers automatically reaching for the carved whalebone before stopping at Inga's sharp intake of breath. "What's this then? It looks like your lighthouse, but smaller." "A gift," Inga said shortly, snatching the carving away before Sigrid could examine it more closely. "Nothing of importance?" "Nothing of importance." Sigrid's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. "Inga, that's the most beautiful carving I've ever seen. Someone spent months creating that, maybe years, and it's clearly meant to represent this place." Her voice softened with sudden understanding. "He made it for you, didn't he? While he was in exile." Inga turned away, busying herself with unnecessary adjustments to her oil supplies. "I don't know what you mean." "You wrote to him." It wasn't a question. Sigrid had always been too perceptive for her own good. "All those letters you sent with the traders, I wondered who they were for, but you never said." "It was Kael Storm-Bound, wasn't it?" The admission hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Inga felt her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of Sigrid's knowing gaze. She had kept the secret of their correspondence for 7 years, but somehow, speaking it aloud felt like the final surrender of her solitude. "It started as courtesy," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He asked for news of home, and I had little else to occupy my evenings. The letters were nothing romantic, just descriptions of village life and seasonal changes, but they meant something to him." Sigrid pressed gently. "And to you, or you wouldn't have continued writing for 3 years. Inga sank into the chair, across from Sigrid, suddenly feeling every one of her 43 years. "They gave me purpose, I suppose, someone to think about besides myself and my grief. But that was a long time ago. I'm different now." Different how? The question was simple, but it cut to the heart of Inga's fears. How could she explain that solitude had become her armor, that she had grown comfortable with the predictable rhythm of lighthouse duties and seasonal maintenance? How could she admit that the thought of opening her heart again, of risking the kind of loss she had endured with Bjorn and her sons, felt impossible? "I've forgotten how to be with people," she said instead. "How to trust that happiness won't be snatched away without warning. It's easier to tend my lighthouse and expect nothing more than the satisfaction of a duty well performed." Sigrid reached across the table and covered Inga's weathered hand with her own smooth one. "But what if you're wrong? What if some risks are worth taking?" Before Inga could answer, another knock sounded at the door. This time it was firmer, more confident, a knock that expected an answer. Both women looked toward the sound, and Inga felt her stomach clench with anticipation and dread. "That'll be him," Sigrid said with satisfaction. "Good. You two need to talk properly instead of dancing around each other like nervous teenagers." "I can't," Inga whispered, but Sigrid was already rising from her chair. "You can and you will," the younger woman said firmly, "because some chances don't come twice. And you've spent 10 years in this tower thinking that solitude was safety. But maybe it's time to discover whether you're strong enough for something more than just surviving." She opened the door before Inga could protest, revealing Kael Storm-Bound standing in the late afternoon light. He had changed from his travel-stained clothes into clean woolen trousers and a linen shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was damp from washing, and the scars on his face seemed less prominent in the golden light. "Inga," he said simply, his eyes finding hers across the room. "I was hoping we could talk." Sigrid stepped aside with a meaningful look at Inga. "I was just leaving. Mind you remember to light the beacon at sunset. Wouldn't want any ships to lose their way in the dark." The words carried obvious double meaning, and Inga shot her a reproachful look that Sigrid ignored completely. The girl slipped past Kael with a cheerful farewell and disappeared down the cliff path, leaving them alone in the lighthouse's warm interior. Kael remained in the doorway, clearly waiting for invitation or dismissal. The afternoon light behind him cast his face into partial shadow, but Inga could feel the intensity of his gaze like heat from a forge. "You don't have to let me in," he said quietly, "but I hope you will. There are things that need saying, things that have waited 10 years for the right moment." Inga looked at the carved lighthouse on her table, at the domestic comfort of her kitchen, at this man who claimed to have dreamed of her beacon through years of exile. Everything sensible told her to send him away, to preserve the peace she had built from the ashes of her old life. Instead, she stepped back from the doorway and gestured him inside. "You might as well come in," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The evening grows cold, and I suppose we do have things to discuss." As he crossed her threshold, Inga felt the last of her afternoon's certainties crumble away, leaving her standing on ground that felt suddenly unsteady beneath her feet. Kael entered the lighthouse with the careful movements of a man who understood that he was crossing more than just a threshold. His eyes swept the interior, the stone walls lined with shelves of oil and supplies, the simple wooden furniture worn smooth by years of use, the narrow stairs that spiraled upward toward the beacon chamber. Everything spoke of a life pared down to its essential elements, beautiful in its stark functionality. "It's exactly as I imagined," he said, his voice soft with something that might have been reverence. "When you wrote about winter evenings spent mending nets by lamplight, about the sound of wind in the beacon chamber, I could see it all so clearly that sometimes I felt I was here with you." Inga busied herself with preparing tea, grateful for the familiar ritual that kept her hands occupied while her mind struggled to process his presence in her most private space. The lighthouse had been her sanctuary for 10 years, a place where no man had set foot since Thorvald came to repair storm damage 3 winters past. Having Kael here felt simultaneously natural and earth-shaking. "You romanticized it in your mind," she said, her tone more brusque than she intended. "The reality is less poetic. Cold mornings, endless maintenance, isolation that can drive a person to talking to the gulls for want of conversation." "Do you talk to the gulls?" He settled into the chair Sigrid had vacated, his large frame making the furniture seem suddenly delicate. Despite herself, Inga felt her lips twitch toward a smile. "Only when they steal fish from the nets. Then I have quite a lot to say to them." The admission surprised her. She had not made a joke in longer than she could remember, and the ease with which it emerged felt foreign but not unwelcome. Kael's answering chuckle was warm and genuine, transforming his scarred features into something approaching the young man she remembered. "In the mountains, I talked to my horse," he confessed. "Poor beast had to listen to years of complaints about the weather, the work, and the questionable cooking skills of my fellow miners. I think she was relieved when I finally decided to come home." "What decided you?" Inga asked, then immediately regretted the question. It felt too intimate, too much like the beginning of the conversation she was not ready to have. But Kael answered without hesitation, his pale eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "A letter arrived at the trading post last spring. Not for me, I hadn't received mail in years, but for one of the other exiles. As he read it, his face changed, and I realized I was seeing a man receive news that his father had died." He paused, running one scarred hand through his silver-streaked hair. "I watched him crumple that letter and throw it in the fire, watched him drink himself into a stupor that night, and I understood something I'd been too stubborn to see before. Time doesn't wait for us to overcome our pride or our fears. The people we care about grow older, face their own struggles, make their peace with our absence. And sometimes, by the time we're ready to come home, there's no home left to return to." Inga set the tea before him with hands that trembled slightly. "So you came back because you were afraid everyone would be dead?" "I came back because I was afraid you would stop lighting the beacon," he said quietly. "That one day I would look north from whatever mountain camp or trading post I was in, and I would know that the lighthouse of Skarnfell had gone dark forever. That the woman who wrote me letters about everyday miracles, about bread rising and nets mending and seasons changing, had given up on the idea that anyone was still finding their way home." The words hit her like a physical blow, stripping away the last of her defensive humor. She sank into the chair across from him, her tea forgotten, and stared at this man who spoke of her beacon as if it were the last light in a dark world. "I light it every night," she whispered. "Even when storms make it seem pointless, even when no ships have passed for weeks, it's my duty." "No," Kael said, leaning forward until she could see the flecks of silver in his blue eyes. "It's your gift to the world. Every night for 10 years, you've climbed those stairs and lit that flame, not because it was your duty, but because you couldn't bear the thought of someone losing their way in the darkness. That's not obligation, Inga. That's love made visible." She felt tears threatening and turned her face toward the window where the afternoon light was beginning to fade. Soon it would be time to climb the stairs and light the beacon, as she had done every evening for a decade. The routine that had once been her anchor now felt like a chain. "You don't understand," she said, her voice thick with unshed emotion. "The beacon isn't love, it's penance. I light it because I couldn't guide my own family safely home, because my sons died in foreign battles and my husband died of grief, and the only thing I know how to do anymore is tend a light that might save someone else's loved ones from the dark." Kael was quiet for a long moment, and when she looked back at him, his expression held such gentle understanding that she had to look away again. "Maybe it started as penance," he said finally, "but that's not what it became. I've seen guilt, Inga. I've carried enough of it to recognize the weight. What you do here, what you've done every night for 10 years, that's not the action of a woman punishing herself. That's the action of a woman who refuses to let the world's darkness win." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his skin. "You wrote to me about your garden, about coaxing life from rocky soil and celebrating each green shoot that pushed through the earth. You wrote about mending nets and baking bread and watching the seasons change the color of the sea. Those weren't the letters of a woman who had given up on life. They were the letters of someone who was determined to find beauty and purpose even in the midst of sorrow. I don't know how to be that woman anymore," Inga admitted, the confession torn from some deep place she had thought permanently sealed. "I don't know how to risk caring about someone who might be taken away." "Then don't risk it all at once," Kael said simply. "Let me stay in the village for a while. Let me help with whatever needs doing. Let me be your friend before we worry about anything else." The offer was so reasonable, so free of pressure or expectation, that Inga felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. She looked at this man who had carried her image through years of exile, who had carved a lighthouse from whalebone and kept it close to his heart, and for the first time allowed herself to consider that perhaps she was not as broken as she believed. "The roof needs new thatch before winter," she heard herself say, "and the garden wall has several loose stones." Kael's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Then that's where we'll start." Outside, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Soon, it would be time to climb the spiral stairs and light the beacon that had guided her through 10 years of solitude. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Inga thought she might not be climbing those stairs alone. The next morning brought the first real test of Kael's promise to help without expectation. Inga woke before dawn, as was her habit, and climbed the lighthouse stairs to extinguish the beacon that had burned through the night. The routine was so ingrained that she moved through it without conscious thought, until she reached the beacon chamber and found a steaming cup of pine needle tea waiting on the windowsill. She stared at the cup as if it were a serpent coiled to strike. No one had ever anticipated her morning ritual, had ever thought to ease the solitary start to her day. The simple kindness of it left her feeling more vulnerable than all of Kael's intimate words the evening before. Through the chamber's windows, she could see him working in her garden below, his large frame bent over the stone wall where several blocks had shifted during the last winter's storms. He had arrived before sunrise and begun work without announcement or fanfare, as if mending her defenses were the most natural thing in the world. Inga sipped the tea, perfectly steeped with just the hint of honey she preferred, and watched him work. His movements were economical and sure, the result of years spent in manual labor, but there was something almost meditative in the way he handled each stone, testing its weight and fit before settling it into place with the care of a craftsman rather than the haste of a hired hand. By the time she descended to ground level, he had reset half the damaged section and was examining the lighthouse's exterior wall for other signs of wear. He looked up at her approach, his face streaked with honest sweat despite the mornings. "Chill. Good morning," he said simply. "I hope you don't mind that I started early. Old habits from the mines, best to get the heavy work done before the sun climbs too high." "You didn't have to," she began, then stopped herself. The automatic rejection felt suddenly foolish. He was here, he was helping, and the work genuinely needed doing. "Thank you," she said instead, "for the tea and for this." Something in his expression shifted. A slight relaxation that suggested her simple acceptance meant more to him than elaborate gratitude would have. "There's satisfaction in building something that will last," he said, hefting another stone into position. "I'd forgotten that, spending so many years in work that was just about survival." Inga found herself settling on the bench that faced the sea, the same spot where she had sat with Sigrid countless afternoons. But watching Kael work felt different, less like observation and more like participation in something larger than either of them alone. "What was it like?" she asked after a stretch of comfortable silence. "The mining camps." Kael paused in his work, considering the question with the care of a man who had learned the difference between curiosity and genuine interest. "Brutal," he said finally. "Not just the work, though that was hard enough. It was the people that wore you down, men running from their pasts or chasing fortunes that would let them forget who they used to be. Everyone watching everyone else, looking for weakness or advantage." He selected another stone, turning it in his hands as if its weight could anchor his memories. "There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who don't trust you and whom you can't trust in return. It makes you forget that there are other ways to live, but you survived it." "I survived it," he agreed, "but I'm not sure I would have stayed whole much longer. There's only so much solitude a man can endure before he stops remembering why he wanted to come home in the first place." The words hung between them, carrying implications that made Inga shift uncomfortably on her bench. She understood too well the danger he described, the slow erosion of purpose that came from too much isolation, too much self-protection. "I used to talk to Bjorn," she admitted suddenly. "In the early years after he died, I would tell him about my day while I prepared the evening meal, about which nets needed mending, about the weather patterns I'd observed, about messages that came with the trading ships. For a while, I could almost believe he was listening." Kael straightened from his work, giving her his full attention. "When did you stop?" The question was gentle but direct, requiring honesty she wasn't sure she was ready to give. "When I realized I was starting to believe he might answer back," she said quietly. "It frightened me, how easy it would be to slip away from the world entirely, so I chose silence instead. And have you been happier for it?" The question should have been simple, but it cut to the heart of everything she had convinced herself about the necessity of her solitude. Had she been happier? Or had she simply been safer, wrapped in routines that protected her from hope as much as from disappointment? "I've been stable," she said finally. "Predictable, safe, but not happy." It wasn't a question this time, and Inga found she couldn't contradict it. Happiness seemed like such a foreign concept, something that belonged to her former life as completely as her identity as wife and mother. But sitting here in the morning sun, watching this scarred exile restore her garden wall with patient devotion, she felt something stirring that might have been the first stirring of contentment she had known in years. "I'm not sure I remember how to be happy," she confessed. Kael set down the stone he was holding and walked to the bench, settling beside her with enough space between them to avoid crowding, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Maybe that's something we could figure out together," he said. "I've forgotten a lot of things too, how to trust, how to hope for something more than just getting through another day. But I remember enough to know that neither of us is meant to face the world alone." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching voices drifted up from the village below. Through the morning haze, Inga could make out a group of riders approaching along the coast road, official-looking men in good wool cloaks, riding horses that spoke of wealth and authority. Kael had seen them too, and something in his posture changed, shifting from the relaxed companionship of a man at ease to the alert wariness of someone accustomed to trouble arriving without warning. "My brother's men," he said quietly, rising from the bench with fluid grace. "It seems my presence in Skarnfell has been reported to the Jarl's hall." Inga felt her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. "What will you do?" "What I should have done yesterday," Kael replied, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. Face whatever consequences my return has earned. He turned to look at her then, his pale eyes serious but unafraid. If things go badly, if Harald decides my exile should be permanent, I want you to know that these 2 days have been worth 10 years of wandering. Being here with you, working on something that matters, it's reminded me who I used to be before pride and stubbornness sent me away. The riders were closer now, close enough that Inga could see the Jarl's banner snapping in the morning breeze. Close enough that there was no time for the words she wanted to say, the promises she wasn't ready to make but desperately wanted to offer. Instead, she reached for his scarred hand and squeezed it once, briefly, letting the gesture carry everything. She couldn't yet voice aloud. "Come back," she said simply. "When you've settled things with your brother, come back and finish the wall." Kael's smile was fierce and grateful and full of something that looked dangerously like hope. "I will," he promised. "One way or another, I will." Then he was striding down the cliff path to meet his past, leaving Inga alone with her lighthouse and her fears, and the half-mended wall that seemed to represent all the broken things that might yet be made whole. For 2 days, Inga heard nothing. From the Jarl's hall, the silence stretched like a held breath across Skarnfell, and even the villagers seemed to move more quietly, as if afraid that too much noise might influence whatever judgment was being rendered behind closed doors. She found herself climbing the lighthouse stairs more frequently than necessary, scanning the coast road for any sign of returning riders. The beacon chamber, with its commanding view of the surrounding countryside, became her watchtower as much as her workplace. Each time she saw movement on the distant paths, her heart would leap, only to sink again when the travelers proved to be ordinary folk going about their daily business. The half-finished garden wall became a silent reproach, its carefully fitted stones standing beside the pile of materials Kael had assembled for the remaining work. Inga found herself touching the completed section throughout the day, running her fingers over the smooth joints where his hands had placed each block with such methodical care. On the second evening, as she prepared to light the beacon, Sigrid appeared at her door with a basket of fresh bread and the determined expression of someone bringing news, whether it was welcome or not. "The Jarl's Council has been meeting since dawn," she announced without preamble. "Closed doors, raised voices, and no one permitted inside except family and the eldest advisors." Inga accepted the bread with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor. "I suppose the whole village is speculating about the outcome." "The whole village is taking sides," Sigrid corrected. "The older folk remember Kael as he was before the exile. Proud, maybe, but honorable. They say Harald was wrong to marry that southern witch, and Kael was right to speak against it, even if his timing was poor." She settled herself at the kitchen table, clearly prepared for a lengthy discussion, whether Inga encouraged it or not. But the younger ones worry about old feuds rekindling, about what it means to have a warrior of his reputation walking free in the village. They remember the stories about what he did in the eastern mountains, the men he killed, the battles he fought. What stories? The question emerged sharper than Inga intended, betraying more concern than she wanted to reveal. Sigrid's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully drawn out the information they were fishing for. "So you do care what happens to him? Good. I was beginning to wonder if you'd gone completely cold." "I asked what stories," Inga repeated firmly. "Nothing too terrible," Sigrid admitted, though her tone suggested she was somewhat disappointed by this fact. "Mostly tales of caravan guards. He helped fend off bandits, mining camps he defended against raiders. But the telling has grown in the years since word first reached us. You know how these things do. By some accounts he killed 50 men single-handed and drinks the blood of his enemies." Despite her anxiety, Inga felt her lips twitch toward a smile. "I rather doubt that. He seemed quite satisfied with pine needle tea." "Ah, so he has been." Taking refreshment at the lighthouse, Sigrid leaned forward with renewed interest. "And how did you find him, our returned exile?" Still the same man who left or changed by his wandering. The question required more honesty than Inga was prepared to offer, even to Sigrid's perceptive curiosity. How could she explain that Kael seemed both utterly familiar and completely transformed? That the boy's reckless pride had been tempered into a man's careful wisdom, while the essential kindness she remembered had only deepened with suffering. "He's older," she said finally, "marked by what he's endured, but not broken by it. And handsome as ever, I'd guess, despite the scars." Heat rose in Inga's cheeks before she could prevent it. "I hardly noticed." Sigrid's laughter filled the lighthouse's main room, bright and knowing. "Oh, you noticed. The question is whether you're brave enough to do anything about it." Before Inga could formulate a suitably discouraging response, the sound of approaching footsteps on the cliff path made both women freeze. The steps were heavy, measured and unmistakably familiar. Inga's heart began beating so rapidly she was certain Sigrid could hear it. "I should go," the younger woman said, rising from the table with barely concealed excitement. "Leave you to your evening duties." She was at the door before Inga could protest, pausing only long enough to add, "Remember what I said about being brave. Some chances don't come twice." Then she was gone, slipping past the figure approaching in the gathering dusk with a cheerful greeting that carried clearly in the still air. Inga remained frozen at her table, afraid to hope, afraid to look, afraid to breathe until she knew whether the footsteps belonged to the man she had been waiting for or someone come to deliver. Knew she didn't want to hear. The knock when it came was gentle but confident. She opened the door to find Kael standing in the twilight, his face grave, but his eyes holding something that might have been relief. "I've been given leave to remain in Skarnfell," he said without preamble. "My exile is officially ended, and I'm free to live where I choose within the boundaries of Nordmark." The words should have brought joy, but something in his tone warned her there was more to the story. "But," she prompted, "but my brother has made it clear that I'm here on sufferance. Harald is Jarl now in all but name, and he's not forgotten. Our old quarrel, even if he's chosen to set it aside. I'm to cause no trouble, seek no position of authority, and remember that I'm here by his grace rather than by right." Kael stepped closer, close enough that she could see the weariness in his face that spoke of 2 days spent navigating the dangerous currents of family politics. "There's more. Harald has heard about my interest in the lighthouse keeper. He wanted to be certain I understood that any disruption to the village's peace would result in permanent banishment." Disruption. Inga's voice came out smaller than she intended. "What sort of disruption?" "The sort that comes from a man with my reputation pursuing a woman who has made her preference for solitude well known," Kael said gently. "Harald fears that forcing unwelcome attention on you might drive you away from Skarnfell entirely, and he has no desire to find a new lighthouse keeper." The implications hit her like cold water. "So you've been warned away from me." "I've been warned to be certain of my welcome before I presume too much," he corrected. "The choice, Harald made quite clear, must be entirely yours." They stood facing each other in the doorway as the last light faded from the sky, two people balanced on the edge of possibility and afraid to tip either direction. Behind Inga, the lighthouse waited for its evening lighting. Beyond Kael, the village settled into another night of gossip and speculation. "The wall is still unfinished," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the evening wind. "It is," he agreed, and she could hear the careful hope he was trying to keep from his voice. "And you did promise to come back and complete it." "I did." She stepped aside, gesturing him into the warm light of her kitchen. "Then I suppose you'd better come in. The evening grows cold, and there's work to be done tomorrow." As he crossed her threshold for the second time, Inga felt something shift inside her chest. Not the crack of breaking defenses this time, but the slow, careful opening of a door that had been locked for too many years. 3 weeks passed in, a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Kael arrived each morning before dawn, worked on various repairs around the lighthouse until the afternoon heat grew too intense, then returned in the evenings to share simple meals and quiet conversation. The garden wall was long finished, but he had found a dozen other tasks that needed attention. Loose roof stones, a warped door that wouldn't close properly, a section of the spiral staircase where the mortar had cracked. Inga told herself it was merely practical to accept his help. The lighthouse required constant maintenance, and she was no longer young enough to handle all the heavy work alone. But if she were being honest, she would admit that she had begun to look forward to his presence in ways that had little to do with practical necessity. He was careful not to presume too much, never staying past the evening meal unless, specifically, invited, never touching her except for the occasional brush of fingers when passing tools or sharing tasks. But there was an intimacy growing between them that felt more significant than any physical contact. The intimacy of shared silences, of understanding glances, of two people learning to trust again after years of protective isolation. It was on a grey morning in late autumn that everything changed. Inga was tending her small garden when she heard the sound of an approaching rider. Not the measured pace of a village messenger, but the urgent rhythm of someone bringing news that couldn't wait. She looked up from her turnip patch to see young Eric, Thorvald's apprentice, urging his pony up the cliff path with more haste than skill. "Inga!" he called, while still 20 yards away. "You need to come to the village. There's been a ship, a southern ship with the Jarl's banner." The words struck her like physical blows. A southern ship meant news from the wider world, possibly news of the ongoing tensions between the northern and southern clans that had cost her so much already. But it was the boy's obvious distress that sent ice shooting through her veins. "What news, Eric?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Is someone hurt?" "Not hurt," Eric panted, sliding from his pony with ungainly urgency. "But they've brought word about the exile, about Kael Storm-Bound. The ship's captain says he's wanted for murder in the eastern settlements. Says there's a bounty on his head and men hunting him who'll follow his trail even here." The words seemed to echo strangely, as if spoken from a great distance. Inga felt the familiar sensation of the world shifting beneath her feet. The same disorientation she had felt when word came of each son's death, when Bjorn's breathing stopped in the night. "Murder," she whispered. "3 men dead in a mining camp called Iron Ridge," Eric continued, his young face flushed with excitement and importance. "The captain says Kael killed them over a gambling dispute and fled before he could be brought to justice. Says the families have put up gold enough to tempt bounty hunters from as far as the mainland kingdoms." Inga sank onto her garden bench, the turnips forgotten at her feet. In her mind, she could see Kael as he had been that morning, patient, gentle, carefully fitting new stones into a section of the lighthouse's foundation that had shifted during the last storm. The man she had been learning to trust, to care for, to hope, might be the answer to her decade of loneliness. "Where is he now?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Gone," Eric said. "Thorvald sent someone to fetch him from the guest house as soon as the ship arrived, but his room was empty. His few belongings, his horse, everything disappeared. They say he must have seen the southern banner and fled before the accusations could be made public." The boy's words continued, but Inga no longer heard them. She was thinking of all the conversations they had shared, all the moments when she had felt safe enough to begin lowering her defenses. Had it all been lies? Had she been such a fool that she couldn't recognize a killer wearing the mask of a gentleman? But even as the doubts flooded through her, another voice in her mind, quieter but more insistent, whispered that something was wrong with this picture. The Kael she knew would not have fled without explanation. He would not have disappeared without a word, leaving her to learn of his supposed crimes from a village boy's breathless gossip. "Eric," she said, cutting through his continued narrative, "who exactly brought these accusations? What was the captain's name?" The boy looked puzzled by the question. I don't know his name, but he wore southern colors and spoke with authority. Thorvald seemed to believe him readily enough. Southern colors. Inga felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. 10 years of peace with the southern clans, but the old animosities ran deep as winter roots. How convenient that accusations should surface now, just when Kael had found his way back to some measure of happiness. I must go to the village, she said, rising from the bench with sudden decision. Will you help me harness the cart? The ride down to Skarnfell passed in a blur of churning thoughts and growing certainty that there was more to this story than a simple murder accusation. She found the village in chaos, with knots of people gathered around the harbour, where the southern ship still rode at anchor, its crew preparing to depart with the afternoon tide. Thorvald met her at the dock, his weathered face creased with concern and something that might have been embarrassment. Inga, lass, I'm sorry you had to hear of it this way. We sent word as soon as we knew, but by then he was already gone. What exactly did the captain tell you? She asked, her voice carrying an authority that made several nearby villagers step closer to listen. That Kael Storm-Bound is wanted for the murder of 3 men at Iron Ridge mining camp, Thorvald replied, but there was something in his tone that suggested his own doubts. The captain had documents, official-looking papers with seals and signatures. Documents. Them can be forged, Inga said flatly. Did you know this captain? Had any of our traders seen him in the southern ports? Thorvald's expression grew more uncomfortable. No, but nothing. Inga turned to address the gathered crowd, her voice carrying clearly over their murmurs. How many of you have seen Kael Storm-Bound these past weeks? Have any of you observed behavior that suggested a man capable of casual murder? The silence that followed was telling. Finally, Astrid the baker stepped forward, her flour-dusted hands twisting nervously in her apron. He's been nothing but courteous, she said quietly. Helped me carry sacks of grain when my back was paining me and never asked for payment. Said it reminded him of helping his own grandmother when he was a boy. Other voices joined hers, hesitant at first but growing stronger. Stories of small kindnesses, of careful respect for village customs, of a man who seemed more interested in honest work than in causing trouble. Then why did he run? Demanded one of the fishermen. Innocent men don't flee in the night. It was a fair question, and one that struck at the heart of Inga's own doubts. But before she could answer, a new voice cut through the discussion, young and breathless and full of urgent information. Because he didn't run. Sigrid appeared at the edge of the crowd, her usual composure replaced by fierce indignation. I saw him this morning before dawn. He was loading supplies into his boat, but not like a man fleeing, like a man preparing for a journey he'd already planned. She pushed through the gathered villagers until she stood beside Inga, her young face flushed with conviction. He asked me to give you this, she said, pressing a folded piece of parchment into Inga's hands. Said to wait until the southern ship arrived, and then you'd understand why he had to leave. Inga unfolded the letter, with hands that trembled only slightly, aware that every eye in the crowd was upon her. Kael's handwriting was as familiar as her own after years of correspondence, and the words he had written carried the weight of careful truth. My dearest Inga, she read aloud, her voice carrying clearly in the harbour's stillness. If you are reading this, then the hunters I have been watching for have finally arrived. The accusations they bring are false, but the men behind them are real and dangerous. I will not bring that danger to Skarnfell, to you, or to people who have shown me nothing but kindness. She paused, her throat tight with emotion, then continued. The truth is this. I did kill 3 men at Iron Ridge, but not in a gambling dispute. They were raiders who attacked a caravan carrying supplies to the settlements. Among the goods they sought to steal were medicines desperately needed by children sick with fever. I tracked them to their camp and gave them the chance to surrender. They chose steel instead. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Inga felt tears threatening but kept her voice steady. The families seeking revenge are not the kin of innocent men, but the clan leaders who profited from the raiding. They have gold enough to buy false testimony and forge documents, and I will not see Skarnfell pay the price for my actions, however justified they may have been. The letter concluded with words that broke her heart, even as they filled it with fierce pride. I go to end this hunt before it can touch the people I care about. If I do not return, know that these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. Keep the beacon burning, my love. There are still souls who need guidance home. When she finished reading, the silence stretched so long that Inga could hear the lap of waves against the dock and the creak of rigging from the southern ship. Finally, Thorvald cleared his throat. It seems we may have been too quick to judgment, he said gruffly. The question now is what we do about it. Inga folded the letter carefully, her mind already racing ahead to the only possible answer. Kael had left to protect them, to draw the hunters away from Skarnfell and face whatever consequences awaited him alone. But he had made one crucial error in his noble gesture. He had forgotten that some bonds once formed could not be severed by distance or danger. We go after him, she said simply, and the words rang with such conviction that no one dared argue. And we bring him home. The next hour passed in a whirlwind of preparation that transformed the sleepy village of Skarnfell into something resembling a war camp. Word of Kael's true situation had spread like fire through dry grass, and what began as Inga's solitary declaration of intent quickly became a collective mission that engaged half the village. Thorvald appointed himself expedition leader, with the authority of a man who had seen enough conflict to know what such a pursuit would require. If we're doing this, we do it properly, he announced to the growing crowd of volunteers. This isn't a pleasure cruise. There are armed men hunting Kael, and they won't hesitate to kill anyone who stands between them and their bounty. While the blacksmith organized supplies and weapons, Inga found herself at the center of a debate she had never expected to participate in. The village wives had surrounded her with the protective instincts of women who had seen too many foolish men march off to unnecessary deaths, and they were not pleased with her plan to join the rescue mission. You've no business on a boat chasing after killers, Astrid declared, her flour-dusted hands planted firmly on her hips. Let the men handle this, and you stay here where it's safe. Safe? Inga's voice carried an edge that made several of the women step back. I've been safe for 10 years, Astrid. Safe and alone and half dead from the weight of it. I'm not staying behind while the first man I've cared about since Bjorn dies because I was too frightened to fight for him. The admission silenced the group more effectively than shouting would have. For a decade, Inga the Widow had been a figure of respected solitude, the lighthouse keeper who needed nothing from anyone. To see her transformed into a woman, declaring her love publicly and preparing to risk her life for it, left the village wives speechless. It was Sigrid who broke the tension, stepping forward with the practical determination that had always marked her as wise beyond her years. She's going, the girl said simply. Anyone with eyes can see that. The question is whether we help her go prepared or waste time trying to change her mind. Within minutes, Inga found herself being fitted with leather armor borrowed from Thorvald's store, a wool cloak waterproofed with seal oil, and a curved seax that had belonged to her late husband. The familiar weight of Bjorn's blade at her hip brought back memories she had thought buried, of the young woman who had once stood beside her shipbuilder husband as he planned voyages to distant shores, who had been partner as much as wife in all their endeavors. You remember how to use that? Thorvald asked, nodding toward the seax. Bjorn taught me, she replied, her hand finding the weapon's grip with muscle memory that hadn't faded despite years of disuse. He said any woman married to a man who traveled dangerous waters should know how to defend herself. The blacksmith nodded approvingly. Good, but remember, this isn't about proving your courage. Stay close to the others, follow orders, and don't try to be a hero. We're going to bring Kael home, not create more widows in the process. By the time their expedition was ready to depart, the sun was already past its zenith. They had commandeered the village's largest fishing vessel, a sturdy craft built for rough seas and capable of carrying 8 people along with supplies for several days. The crew consisted of Thorvald and 2 of his apprentices, 3 of the village's most experienced fishermen, Sigrid despite protests about her age, and Inga herself. The southern ship had departed hours earlier, but its course had been noted by several of the fishing fleet. It was heading northeast toward the scattered islands that marked the boundary between Nordmark and the wild territories beyond. If Kael was indeed being hunted, that was where he would make his stand, in waters he knew well, far from innocent settlements that might be caught in the crossfire. As their own vessel cleared the harbor and caught the afternoon wind, Inga found herself standing at the bow, with her eyes fixed on the horizon. The lighthouse fell away behind them, its flame unlit in the daylight hours, and for the first time in a decade she was leaving her post without knowing when she would return. "Second thoughts?" Sigrid asked, joining her at the rail. "Every moment since we left the dock," Inga admitted, "but not about going, about whether we'll be in time to make a difference." The younger woman studied her profile with the perception that had always made her an uncomfortable companion. "You love him," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I think I always did," Inga replied, surprising herself with the admission. Even when he was just words on parchment, a voice from exile that reminded me there was still kindness in the world, but I was too afraid to acknowledge it, too convinced that loving someone meant losing them. And now, Inga looked out at the grey waters ahead, at the path that led toward either reunion or heartbreak, and felt a certainty that had nothing to do with safety or sensible choices. "Now I understand that losing someone you love is terrible, but never having loved them at all is worse," she said. "If Kael dies, at least he'll die knowing that someone cared enough to come after him, that someone thought he was worth fighting for." The hours passed in a blur of wind and spray and growing tension. The fishing captain, a grizzled man named Olaf, who had been navigating these waters for 40 years, pushed the boat hard toward the outer islands, where his contacts among the seal hunters had reported unusual activity. Ships moving in formation, armed men setting up camps on beaches that were usually empty except for seasonal wildlife. As evening approached, they spotted their first sign of the hunt, a column of black smoke rising from one of the smaller islands. Olaf changed course immediately, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that smoke in these remote waters usually meant violence. They beached their vessel on a stretch of shingle beach on the island's lee side, well away from whatever was happening on the other shore. Thorvald organized them into 2 groups, the fighters who would investigate the smoke, and Sigrid with one of the apprentices who would guard their boat and be ready for a quick departure if needed. "I should stay with the boat," Inga said, though every instinct screamed against the suggestion. "I'm not trained for this kind of fighting." "You're not staying anywhere," Thorvald replied firmly. "If Kael's over there, he needs to see you're safe with his own eyes. That's what will keep him from doing something stupid and heroic that gets us all killed." The trek across the island took them through dense pine forest and over rocky terrain that seemed designed to catch unwary feet and turn ankles. But Inga had grown up on Skarnfell's cliffs, and she matched the pace of younger, stronger legs with the endurance of someone accustomed to daily climbs up lighthouse stairs. As they neared the source of the smoke, the sounds of conflict became audible. Shouting voices, the ring of steel on steel, and underneath it all the crackling roar of flames, consuming wood and canvas. They crept to the edge of the tree line and peered down at a scene that made Inga's blood run cold. The beach below was littered with the remains of what had been a ship's camp. Tents burned fiercely, sending the column of smoke they had seen from miles away. Bodies lay scattered in the sand, men in southern colors who would never collect another bounty. And in the center of the chaos, surrounded by a half-dozen armed hunters, stood Kael Storm-Bound, with a bloodied sword in his hand and death in his pale eyes. He was fighting magnificently, his blade weaving patterns of destruction that spoke. to years of desperate survival in hostile territory, but even Inga could see that the numbers were wrong, that no matter how skilled he was, 6 against 1 would eventually wear him down. "We have to help him," she whispered, her hand finding the grip of Bjorn's seax. "We will," Thorvald replied grimly, "but we do it smart. Olaf, take your men around to the left. I'll go right with Eric. Inga, you stay here until we've evened the odds. Then we'll—" His words were cut off by a new sound from the beach below. The horn call that every coastal dweller knew meant ships approaching fast. Inga looked toward the harbor and felt her heart sink. 3 more vessels were rounding the point, their sails full of wind and their decks crowded with armed men. The hunters who had cornered Kael were just the advance party. The real force was just arriving, and there were far too many of them for a fishing boat crew to handle, no matter how determined they might be. "We're too late," one of Thorvald's apprentices whispered. But Inga was studying the scene below with the analytical mind that had kept her lighthouse functioning through storms and emergencies for 10 years. The hunters surrounding Kael were focused entirely on their prey, watching his sword rather than scanning for threats from the tree line. The approaching ships were still several minutes from landing, their crews busy with the complex task of beaching heavy vessels on an unfamiliar shore. There was a window, narrow and dangerous, but a window nonetheless. "No," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once helped her manage a shipbuilder's business and raise 3 sons. "We're not too late, but we have to move now before those ships land. And we have to trust that Kael will understand what we're trying to do." She looked around at the faces of the people who had followed her into this desperate situation, seeing fear, but also determination, doubt, but also loyalty. These were her neighbors, her friends, people who had chosen to risk their lives because they believed in the rightness of what they were attempting. "When we go down there," she said quietly, "some of us may not come back up. I need you all to know that I understand what you're risking for me, for him, and I won't forget it whatever happens." Thorvald's grin was fierce and full of anticipation. "Inga, lass, we're not doing this for you. We're doing it because it's right, and because that man down there is one of us, whether his brother acknowledges it or not. Now stop making speeches, and let's go save the stubborn fool before he gets himself killed." As they prepared to charge down the slope toward whatever fate awaited them, Inga touched the carved whalebone lighthouse that she had carried with her from Skarnfell. Soon they would know whether love and loyalty were enough to overcome the darkness, or whether some lights were destined to be extinguished despite all efforts to keep them burning. The charge down the slope happened faster than thought, faster than fear, driven by the primitive understanding that hesitation meant death for everyone involved. Inga found herself running through pine needles and over moss-slick stones, with Bjorn's seax in her hand, and her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. Thorvald's war cry split the evening air, a sound that carried the fury of honest men facing those who would profit from murder. The hunters surrounding Kael spun toward the tree line, just as 7 figures burst from the forest, weapons raised and faces set with the grim determination of people who had already made peace with their own mortality. The first hunter to react was also the first to die. Olaf's fishing spear took him in the chest before he could draw his sword, the iron point driven with the strength of arms accustomed to hauling nets full of struggling fish. The man fell backward into the sand with a sound like a wet sack hitting stone. Kael himself seemed to understand their desperate gambit in an instant. Rather than looking toward his unexpected rescuers, he pressed his attack on the remaining hunters with renewed fury, his sword becoming a thing of liquid silver in the dying light. 2 more men fell to his blade before the chaos of the melee could organize itself into anything resembling a battle. But the hunters were seasoned fighters, men who had survived by being quicker and more ruthless than their prey. They recovered from their surprise with lethal efficiency, spreading out to engage multiple opponents while calling for support from their comrades on the approaching ships. Inga found herself face to face with a scarred southerner whose eyes held the flat emptiness of a man who killed for coin rather than conviction. He came at her with a curved blade that whispered through the air where her throat had been a heartbeat before, and she realized with crystalline clarity that all the practice sessions with Bjorn 20 years ago had not prepared her for the reality of mortal combat, but they had taught her to think while moving, to use her opponent's assumptions against him. The hunter expected an easy victory over an older woman wielding an unfamiliar weapon. He pressed forward aggressively, leaving himself open for the upward thrust that took him under the ribs and into the heart. The shock of killing, the resistance of flesh and bone against steel, the look of surprise in dying eyes hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the bloodied sayax. Only Sigrid's shouted warning saved her from the sword stroke that would have ended her contemplation of mortality with brutal finality. She rolled aside, came up with the sayax raised defensively, and found herself staring at another hunter whose grin suggested he thought she had simply been lucky with her first kill. This one was more cautious, circling her like a wolf testing the defenses of unfamiliar prey. Around them, the battle raged with savage intensity. Thorvald wielded his smithing hammer like an instrument of divine judgment, each blow connecting, with sounds that would haunt her dreams if she lived to have them. His apprentices fought with the desperate courage of young men trying to prove themselves worthy of their master's teaching. But the approaching ships were almost ashore now, their hulls scraping against the shingle beach as dozens of armed men prepared to join the fight. Even if the rescue party could defeat the original hunters, they would be overwhelmed within minutes by fresh fighters who outnumbered them 5-1. It was then that Kael's voice cut through the din of combat, carrying with it the authority of a man who had commanded others in desperate situations. "The boats!" he shouted, his sword never pausing in its deadly work. "Burn their boats!" The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. The hunters had beached their vessels in a line along the shore, their crews focused entirely on getting ashore. To join the fight, the boats were undefended, and without them even victory in the immediate battle would leave the hunters stranded on a remote island with limited supplies. Inga saw Olaf break away from his opponent and sprint toward the nearest vessel, a burning brand from the destroyed camp in his weathered hands. But her own fight demanded immediate attention as the circling hunter chose that moment to attack, his blade coming at her in a pattern of strikes designed to overwhelm her defense through sheer speed. She gave ground steadily, her breathing becoming ragged as she struggled to match his pace. The sayax was shorter than his sword, forcing her to stay close to be effective, but getting close meant accepting risks that her inexperienced reflexes couldn't always handle. A shallow cut opened along her left forearm, then another across her thigh. The hunter's grin widened as he sensed her weakening, and he pressed forward for what he clearly intended to be the killing blow. But he had forgotten that desperate people are often the most dangerous. Inga stepped inside his guard instead of away from it, accepting a thrust that scored along her ribs in order to drive Bjorn's sayax up under his chin and into his brain. They fell together in the sand, hunter and lighthouse keeper locked in their final embrace, and for a moment the world went grey around the edges. When her vision cleared, she found Kael standing over her with his sword dripping red and his scarred face twisted with fury that had nothing to do with the battle and everything to do with seeing her wounded. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice rough with emotions too complex to name. "Yes, I should," she replied, accepting his hand to pull her upright. "Now help me get to those boats before more of them land." Behind them, the first of the beached vessels was already burning, Olaf's torch having found the oil-soaked rigging with devastating effect. But there were still 2 more ships disgorging armed men onto the beach, and the window for escape was closing faster than either of them wanted to acknowledge. The race to the remaining ships became a desperate sprint through sand that seemed to grab at their feet with every step. Behind them, the surviving hunters from the original group were rallying, while ahead, fresh fighters poured from the beached vessels like ants from a disturbed hill. Kael moved beside Inga with fluid grace, his sword cutting down anyone who tried to intercept their path to the water's edge. But she could see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, the slight favoring of his left leg that spoke to wounds taken before their arrival. He had been fighting alone for too long, and even his legendary endurance had limits. There, Sigrid's voice cut through the chaos, pointing toward the second vessel where Thorvald was already setting fire to the rigging with systematic efficiency. The blacksmith moved with the methodical determination of a craftsman, ensuring that each flame would spread properly before moving to the next target. But it was the third ship that would determine their fate. Its crew had organized more quickly than the others, forming a defensive line on the beach while their captain shouted orders from the stern. These were professional soldiers rather than mere bounty hunters, men who understood the value of discipline under pressure. "We need to reach that ship," Kael said, his breathing heavy but controlled. "If even one vessel escapes, they'll bring back an army." Inga looked at the organized formation blocking their path and felt her heart sink. They were down to 5 fighters, herself, Kael, Thorvald, one of the apprentices, and Olaf. Sigrid was somewhere behind them, hopefully staying clear of the worst fighting as she had been instructed. The odds were impossible, but she had not come this far to surrender to arithmetic. "Then we reach it," she said simply, adjusting her grip on the bloodied sayax. Together. What followed was less a battle than a controlled catastrophe. They hit the soldiers' line like a storm wave against a seawall, and for a moment it seemed they might break through by sheer momentum. Kael fought with the fury of a man protecting everything he had ever loved, his blade singing through the air in patterns that spoke to years of desperate survival. Thorvald's hammer crushed shields and bones with equal efficiency, while Olaf's spear found gaps in armor with the precision of a man who had spent decades judging distances on rolling seas. Even young Eric, the apprentice, fought with courage that would have made his master proud, but there were too many enemies and too few allies. Inga felt, rather than saw Olaf go down, heard Thorvald's grunt of pain as a spear point found its mark. They were being overwhelmed by degrees, pushed back step by bloody step, toward the burning wreckage of the camp. It was then that the impossible happened. A horn sounded from the harbor, its deep note carrying clearly over the sounds of battle. Then another, and another, until the air rang with a chorus of war calls that made every combatant pause and look toward the water. Ships, a dozen of them at least, with familiar square sails and dragon-headed prows that spoke of home and rescue. Beyond all hope, at their head sailed a vessel that Inga recognized even at distance, the Jarl's personal longship, flying banners that commanded respect from every warrior in the northern clans. "Harold," Kael breathed, and there was wonder in his voice as well as recognition. The effect on their enemies was immediate and decisive. Professional soldiers could face desperate odds when they thought victory was still possible, but none of them had signed contracts that included fighting the entire northern fleet. The captains shouted orders, changed from attack to retreat, and within moments the surviving hunters were scrambling back toward their remaining ship with the panicked efficiency of men who had suddenly discovered they were the ones outnumbered. But the third vessel was already too damaged to sail. Thorvald's methodical fire setting had done its work too well, and the rigging collapsed into the surf even as the crew tried to push off from the beach. The ship listed, took on water, and settled into the shallows as thoroughly stranded as a beached whale. Inga found herself sitting heavily in the sand, her wounds finally making themselves known now that the immediate danger had passed. Around her, the beach looked like something from a saga. Bodies scattered like driftwood, smoke rising from burning ships, the detritus of violence painting the evening in shades of red and black. But they were alive. impossibly, miraculously, alive. Kael dropped beside her, his sword finally still, and for a moment they simply stared at each other in the growing dusk. He reached out to touch her face with fingers that shook slightly, as if he needed to confirm that she was real and not some fever dream born of battle madness. "You came for me," he said, and his voice held such wonder that she felt tears threatening, despite the pain and exhaustion. "Of course I came," she replied, leaning into his touch. "I finally understood what you meant about home. It's not a place you can carry in memory. It's where the people you love choose to wait for your return." The sound of approaching boats reached them then, Harold's fleet making for shore with the efficiency of experienced naval forces. Soon there would be questions to answer, explanations to give, and the complex business of cleaning up the aftermath of violence. But for now, there was only this: two people who had found each other again despite impossible odds, sitting together on a blood-soaked beach, while the lighthouse beacon of love finally burned bright enough to guide them both safely home. 6 months later, Inga stood at the top of her lighthouse as the spring sun painted the waters of Skarnfell in shades of gold and emerald. The beacon chamber had been rebuilt over the winter, its bronze mirror polished to perfection and its oil stores replenished for the season ahead. But the most significant change was not in the lighthouse itself, but in the fact that she no longer climbed the stairs alone. Kael emerged from the spiral staircase below, carrying 2 cups of morning tea, and moving with the easy familiarity of a man who had learned every stone of the ancient tower. The scars on his face had faded somewhat, though they would always mark him as a survivor of harder times. More importantly, the shadows that had haunted his pale eyes during those first weeks after the battle had gradually given way to something that looked remarkably like contentment. "The village council meeting is this afternoon," he reminded her, settling the tea on the windowsill where she could reach it without leaving her post. "Harold wants to finalize the arrangements for the new trading agreements with the eastern settlements." Inga accepted the cup gratefully, her fingers brushing, in a gesture that still sent warmth through her, despite months of such casual intimacy. "And you're certain about accepting his offer?" The offer in question was a formal position as Harold's advisor on Eastern affairs, recognition both of Kael's decade of experience beyond Nordmark's borders and of the reconciliation between the brothers that had emerged from the events on that blood-soaked beach. It would mean regular travel, important responsibilities, and a return to the kind of public life that Kael had abandoned when he chose exile. "I'm certain," he replied, though his tone suggested they had discussed this question many times before. "The eastern settlements need someone who understands both their struggles and Nordmark's interests, and Harold needs advisors he can trust completely, especially now that the southern clans are making overtures about renewed trade." It was a practical answer, but Inga heard the deeper truth beneath it. Kael had found his way back not just to Skarnfell, but to the sense of purpose that had driven him before pride and politics sent him into exile. The difference now was that his purpose was tempered by wisdom, seasoned by suffering, and grounded in the understanding that true strength came not from standing alone, but from knowing when to accept help from others. "Besides," he added with a smile that transformed his scarred features, "the position comes with extended periods of residence at Skarnfell. Something about the advisor needing to maintain close consultation with the lighthouse keeper on matters of coastal navigation." Inga laughed, a sound that still felt new and precious after years of silence. "Harold said no such thing. Harold is a wise Jarl who understands that some partnerships are too valuable to separate unnecessarily," Kael replied diplomatically, "and who has learned that his brother functions considerably better when he's not pining for a certain lighthouse keeper." The transformation in Harold had been perhaps the most surprising outcome of the rescue mission. The brother who had once banished Kael in jealous anger had arrived at that island beach, with the full force of Nordmark's navy, having somehow learned of the hunt and decided that family loyalty trumped old grievances. The reunion between the brothers had been awkward at first, marked by years of hurt and mistrust, but it had grown into something resembling the partnership they might have achieved if pride had not driven them apart in their youth. "The new apprentice arrives next week," Inga said, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. "Young Astrid from the inland villages. She's never seen the sea before, but she has steady hands and isn't afraid of heights." The apprentice was another change that would have seemed impossible a year ago. For 10 years, Inga had guarded her solitude jealously, convinced that she was meant to tend the lighthouse alone until age or injury made the work impossible. But love, she had discovered, had a way of expanding rather than diminishing one's capacity for caring about others. The girl would live in the newly built quarters attached to the lighthouse's base, learning the complex rhythms of beacon maintenance, while providing an extra pair of hands for the work that never seemed to end. More importantly, she would ensure that the light of Skarnfell would continue to shine long after Inga herself could no longer climb the spiral stairs. "Are you nervous about training someone?" Kael asked, reading her expression with the perception that came from months of learning to understand each other's silences as well as their words. "Terrified," Inga admitted. "What if I've grown too set in my ways to be a good teacher? What if she finds the isolation unbearable? What if—" Kael silenced her questions with a gentle kiss, brief but full of the quiet devotion that had become the foundation of their life together. When he pulled back, his expression held such tender amusement that she had to smile despite her worries. What if she's lucky enough to learn from the woman who kept this beacon burning through the worst storms any of us have ever seen? He countered. What if she discovers that tending a lighthouse isn't just about maintaining a flame, but about maintaining hope for everyone who might need guidance home? Through the chamber windows, they could see the village below beginning its daily routines. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played in the streets, and fishing boats prepared for another day's work in waters that had been made safer by the light that burned above them every night. It was a simple life, measured in ordinary moments and small kindnesses rather than grand gestures or dramatic adventures. But it was theirs, built from the careful trust of two people who had learned that love was not something to be feared, but something to be tended with the same devotion they brought to maintaining the beacon that guided lost souls safely home. As the morning light strengthened and the day's work beckoned, Inga touched the carved whalebone lighthouse that now sat on the windowsill beside their morning tea. The little carving had become their private symbol, a reminder that some lights burn bright enough to guide travelers across impossible distances and through the darkest of nights. Home, she thought, was indeed where the people you loved chose to wait for your return, but it was also where you chose to stay, building something lasting with hands that had learned to trust in tomorrow's possibilities rather than yesterday's sorrows. The beacon of Skarnfell would burn tonight, as it had, every night for generations, but now it burned not as penance for the past, but as promise for the future. A future shared by two people who had found their way back to each other and to the understanding that some lights are meant to shine together, casting their glow twice as far as either could alone.